So for my final, I decided to do a data set, and I got my data set from data.gov, which was an FDIC failed bank list. This list had every bank that has failed since October 1st, 2000. So to start off, I imported the pandas library along with my data set, and I gave it the variable name bank list. Following this, in order to get a good look at the size of the data set, I used a shape function, which told me that the data set had 561 columns, or 561 rows and 6 columns, 561 being the number of banks, and columns being bank name, city, state, certification number, the acquiring institution, or whatever bigger bank bought it out, and the closing date. Next, I decided to use the head and tail functions to give me a good look at what the data set actually looked like. As you can see here, gave me a good feel for, well, the head gave me the 5 most recent closings, and tail gave me the 5 earliest closings. Next, I decided to clean up my data a little bit by looking for duplicates using the duplicated function. There were no duplicates, which was good to see. Next, I decided to play around with the value counts function and the ID max function and the max function. I used this in order to see what was most common in each column. For example, for the city column, Chicago was the most common city with 20 bank failures occurring in Chicago. Like First State Bank had 3 failures, which was the most for any bank, and Georgia had 93 failures, which was the most for any state. Next, I decided to use the info function to show me what columns I had in my data set, which you could see, which I named earlier, along with their respective data types. Most of them are objects, with the certification number being in integers, because it's all numbers, but I didn't really decide to use that in this project. Next, I played around with the value counts function, and I did that for city, the state, and the acquiring institution. It just shows, well, here it gave the top 5 cities for bank failures, Chicago being the top, which I said earlier, and going down to Atlanta, Phoenix, etc. States showed that, like, once again, Georgia was the top, but it also had every single state where a bank failure occurred, along with their respective number of failures. Same thing for the acquiring institution. I just was kind of curious about what companies were buying out other banks, and you can see that State Bank and Trust Company had the most, bought out the most failed banks. This meaning that bank wasn't bought out by a bigger company. Next, before I went into the graphing part of my project, I imported the NumPy package along with the matplotlib inline, which it's like a plotting library. So I imported those. To start off my graphs, I did the city graph, value counts, sort index plot. This listed every single city. That's why it's all bunched up here. And I kind of fixed that later in the project. And I did the same for the acquiring institution, along with the bank name and state. So all my columns, I decided to put them into graphing format to kind of look at trends. They're all bunched up here. That's why I decided to switch to bar graphs here. And when using bar graphs, I also used the head function. This helped me keep it to just the top 5, and it was much easier to read. As you can see, they're not all bunched up. But so for my first one, I used city column again, value counts, which I talked about earlier, and head, and then plot, kind bar, which made it a bar graph. And this just showed what cities had the most occurrences in bank failures, the acquiring institution, which I showed earlier, the bank name, and the state. This just made it as like a good visual to look, that someone could look at in order to see where all these failures were occurring. Next, something I wanted to do from the beginning was take a look at the 2008 economic crisis and see how results could change based on what occurred there. I found some good information on how many failures occurred in what year. And this required a little figuring out because I was trying to figure out how to get the data to specify to a certain year. And I used the string ends with function in order to kind of like choose what year I wanted to focus on. And I gave this the name rec, short for recession, '06. And this data set here represents 2006. This data set represents 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, all the way up to 2012. And by doing this, and by using the shape function, I got a good feel for how many bank failures occurred in that year. For example, 2008 was 25, 2009, 140, 2010, 157, 2011, 92, which I thought was very interesting that most of the bank closures occurred after 2008. And once I had all these variables, I decided to use some of them and graph them, once again with the bar graph, using the head function and the value count function. So for 2009, it shows that most of the bank failures occurred in Georgia again, but in 2010, most of the bank failures occurred in Florida, which is interesting. And in 2011, most of the bank closures occurred in Georgia once again, which I thought was interesting. This is just a quick summary. And some things I learned from this project is that Georgia had the most bank closures due to the 2008 economic crash and the most overall. Chicago had the most closures for a city with 20. 2010 had the most closures with 157. Most of the bank closures didn't occur until after 2008, which I thought was interesting. Most of the failed banks were bought out, while 30 had no acquirer. And what I still want to find out is, I would like to look into the 2008 crash further and see what I can find out. There's a lot of interesting data to work with, and I would like to dive into some trends involving dates and locations. Thank you.